Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Geyn, and today we're talking about bubble zones and the constitutional protection of freedom of expression. Bubble zones, also known as safe access laws, prohibit protests within defined geographic areas. Anyone who protests within the protected bubble can face penalties, sometimes criminal in nature. Originally developed to prevent pro life protests around abortion clinics after some high profile incidents of serious violence, the use of bubble zones has rapidly expanded. There are now bubble zones around hospitals, healthcare facilities, schools, libraries, community centers, arts centers, and recently a Liberal MP proposed creating bubble zones around MP offices. While bubble zones have been upheld in courts but in the context of abortion clinics, these other new expansions have not been tested. Would they survive constitutional scrutiny? Are these policies necessary to protect vulnerable people, or are they censoring discussion and silencing debate? Here today to discuss the issue are two experts, Professor Richard Moon of the University of Windsor School of Law and Ga Grant from the BC Civil Liberties Association. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Professor Moon, let's start with the origins of these bubble zone laws, which I understand began in the 1990s in Canada, with the first one being in BC. What can you tell me about the context that led up to the enactment of the laws, including some of that violence that we saw in the early 90s?
Yeah, I think predating the BC law was, in fact, an injunction that was issued in Ontario in relation to one of the clinics or the clinics established by Henry Morgentaler, principally in Toronto. Um, a- and as you said in the introduction, I think the principal concern behind these laws and initially the injunction was safety and security of those involved. Those either working or attending as patients, the clinics. I think there's also been an expansion or extension of our understanding of the necessity for these zones, and that relates to a sense of privacy or dignity of those attending these, and that's something maybe we can talk about in a minute. What are the rights or interests of individuals in public spaces not to be confronted with speech that they might consider to be invasive, harsh in some way?
Now, Gav, I know that the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, when the first bubble law was introduced, and some people call it a statutory injunction because I guess it operates the way that pre-bubble zone injunction law it makes it sort of a statutized injunction. When that first was introduced as a statute, the BC Civil Liberties Association opposed it. Um, the BC law was challenged in a case called R and Lewis, and it was upheld. But I understand the BC Civil Liberties Association has changed their position now. So, what's your take on the abortion clinic bubble zones now and on the RV Lewis case?
Yes, so why the BCCLA did initially oppose abortion bubble zones, that decision was reversed not long after by our board. Although we've had concerns about how bubble zones are being used and the transparency about when new bubble zones are being declared and how they're doing that. So the contention is really around the justification for the bubble zones, although there's no doubt that in our view that and in the court's view that these were restrictions on freedom of expression, and in our view they also impact assembly, potentially liberty and mobility interests as well. That's where the debate has mostly been at whether this can really rise to the justification of the Oakes test, and we haven't changed our view that abortion bubble zones in the specific context of someone's right to access reproductive healthcare and that protected Section 7 right with safety and dignity and privacy, as in the Lewis decision, still remains.
So the Oakes test, for those who are watching and maybe not familiar with some of the language that lawyers use, is a test used under Section 1 of the Charter. So once a right, like the right to freedom of expression, is engaged or it's being violated, what the court does is it asks if under Section 1 of the Charter that limit can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And the answer to that question is answered through an analytical framework from a case called Oakes that asks a number of questions, including whether the impairment whether it's minimally impairing, whether it's proportionate, and what the public purpose being served is. We've got to go to commercial break right now, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about bubble laws, which are safe access laws that prohibit protest within a certain specified area. Now, since the 1990s, when courts upheld bubble zones around abortion clinics, these laws have sort of expanded to begin applying to other places. And as far as I can tell, the expansion's fairly recent, with a lot of bubble zones actually being created by municipalities. And I'll list a few of them. I know Calgary banned so called advocacy messaging within 150 meters of schools. The federal government created bubble zones around healthcare facilities that prevent protests that block entry and egress. The city of Calgary created a bylaw that prohibits so called specified protests, so protests about certain subjects, if those protests are close to libraries, community centers, and art centers. In Quebec, there are bubble zones around hospitals and schools. And those are just a few examples of, these are all bubble zones implemented since 2020. So, Professor Moon, what do you think is behind this sudden increase in the use of this legal tool?
Yeah, I don't think there's a simple answer to that. There, of course, are legitimate concerns about harassment, violence, and so forth at the I think access points of different buildings, different kinds of operations. I also think, and I think this is a real concern, is um, there's a great concern about captive audiences or a concern about the right not to listen to something. And well, I think it's true that we should be conscious and of certain rights or interests individuals have, not to be harassed, and certain moments in their lives that may be deeply personal or private in character to not be harassed or confronted by others. At the same time, I don't think we want to be careful not to overstate the right of individuals to not be confronted with messages they don't want to hear in public spaces. And so I'm concerned a bit about that. I think captive audience arguments sometimes have more weight in the United States because they don't have laws against hate speech, for example. Here, I think the necessity of being concerned with captive audience maybe not as great. In any event, it's really important that the restrictions not be founded on um, some right of an individual, non-right really, of an individual not to hear to be free from hearing messages that they disagree with.
Ga, what's your take? And what I'd point out, and that I'm interested in your thoughts on, is all of these bubble zones I listed are pretty different from one another, and they're different from abortion bubble zones. Do you think that the rationale for prohibiting protests near an abortion clinic, that does that rationale hold when you're talking about prohibiting protests near a library or a school or a community center?
So, some of these new examples we don't formally have a position on yet, but we have to apply an analysis where we really understand why it's being invoked, and the importance of that specific location. For example, hospitals are closer to the rationale that we saw in Lewis around accessing healthcare. So that's a little bit closer to that. And people don't really have a choice whether they're accessing healthcare. Children don't really have a choice about going to school either. So you can make that distinction in terms of the role that schools play and libraries play. It's also different. I would argue that libraries are really important places for social discussion, free sharing of information, knowledge, freedom of expression. They're really important places for our democracy. So I would say that it's a more concerning location. In terms of schools, there's really specific harms that we know can happen to youth. And so, in Lewis, we saw a look at what the harms are. So I think it really depends on the context and the nature of whether what kind of threats are being is there a real risk of violence, like
Mhm.
actual violence, and how are those harms being understood?
One quick question, Ga, which is, I know the right to free expression is content neutral. So would these prohibit, for example, labor action or picketing around these facilities?
I'm not sure. I would have to review them specifically to give you an answer on that one.
Professor Moon, any thoughts on that?
I don't know the answer to scope of that, but I would assume it would not apply to a picket established in certainly the public areas outside of a place that's on strike.
Interesting. So we've got to go to commercial break now, but when we come back, I want to talk about this proposal by a Liberal MP to prevent protests around the offices of politicians and how our analysis from the abortion clinic bubble zones might apply in that proposal. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing bubble zones or laws that prohibit protests within a certain geographic area. Now, Liberal Member of Parliament Marco Mendocino has suggested adding politicians' offices to the already fairly lengthy list of places where protests are either prohibited or where there are special heightened penalties for harassment within that area. Under Mendocino's proposal, anyone who intimidated or otherwise harassed people within a buffer zone of 50 to 100 meters would be subject to harsher criminal penalties, including jail time. Now, Professor Moon, one of the things that's interesting to me is part of the rationale for bubble zones is to protect vulnerable populations. And frankly, I just do not see that rationale around politicians. I think of politicians offices is the place where people often go to engage in protests. And politicians are powerful people, they're not vulnerable groups. But what's your take on the proposal?
Well, I do think it's important to separate the two different factors or considerations that lie behind bubble zones. I mean, one of them is physical safety and security. The other is really individuals who are owed a certain amount of kind of privacy or dignity when they are engaging in a certain activity, whether that be seeking abortion services or a funeral or something along those lines. So we do need to separate those two things. So clearly, politicians don't need to be protected from messages they don't like. That's
I think they
without any
should be
question or
exposed
doubt.
to them, frankly.
Yeah, no, exactly. Um, so it really is about security and safety. And I I understand where this is coming from. Once upon a time, our politicians didn't need any kind of security as they walked about in public spaces, and now they do. There is far more in the way of threats, harassments, threats of physical violence that are circulating, and it's become a real deterrent for individuals to run for office. We've seen individuals leave public office because of the incredible amount of harassment they face. I don't know enough about what goes on outside of constituency offices, but we have quite a bit of evidence that there is real threats of violence out there. So, what the right approach to that is, I don't know. But nevertheless, I assume that's the logic behind it. So, politicians or not, they are owed some level of security and safety.
Ga, what's your take on the proposal?
The BCCLA would definitely or be very likely to oppose any policy around this because buffer zones, MP offices, I mean, constituency offices, parliament offices, they go right to the heart of freedom of expression. And this kind of political speech is really important that we have this, our power is so concentrated in our government in Canada. We need to make sure that there is mechanisms for people to be able to have that connection and speak to the people that represent them, and on the other side, representatives can be sure to hear and be accountable to the people that they represent. And I think there's also a risk that, if there's real violence, that's one thing, but there's also a risk of government misusing rationale for this kind of buffer zone when it's just speech that might make them uncomfortable, which again is very different than real threats. And we have you asked the question about increased why do we have increased call for buffer zones. In my perspective, there's increased social unrest and there's real social problems that are facing our society. And so people are trying to find ways to be heard and to have these changes. So if everyone is wrapped up in bubble wrap, so to speak, it's going to limit our democracy to function and for the power of our protest to make the social change that we need.
Now we've only got about a minute left, so I'm going to pose a question and we'll discuss it when we come back. But there's something about bubble zones that seems redundant to me. I mean, police can use existing tools to address protests that block entry or exit to certain places. They can use existing tools to deal with blockades or harassments. The place of the protest can obtain an objection. And there's also this sort of naivete to me about the idea that a bubble zone will prohibit serious violence. I mean, I think someone who's intent on committing assault or murder or arson, they're not going to say, oh, well, I better not commit this serious criminal offense in this area because it's in a bubble. I'll make sure to that act is already seriously penalized by our criminal law. So my question, which we can discuss when we're back from the break, is why are these additional laws really necessary when we already have a lot of tools at the disposal of police to address some of these serious issues when they come up? We'll go to break and we'll discuss that when we're back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing free speech bubble zones, so laws that prohibit protests around specified places or in specified areas. Now, in the last segment, I posed this question of why bubble zones are even necessary when there's existing laws that can deal with things like harassment, intimidation, serious criminal offenses when they take place. You can obtain an injunction to remove people from your area if you own the property. And I think one of the things we've seen is police are often not enforcing the existing law. So, Professor Moon, why are these additional laws even necessary if there already are legal tools?
Well, again, it depends to some extent on what the logic or justification for a particular bubble zone is. Um, the right of individuals to pass through, to enter into a particular building without being confronted by others, that occurs in some cases. We're talking about funerals, we're talking about abortion clinics, and so forth. If the concern is safety, I think the logic is that to create this zone creates at least a clear sphere where certain individuals who may be threatening in character can't enter into. As well, violence is sometimes impulsive, it happens at the moment. And so to create a zone where individuals can't be present, engaged in protest, or however they understand it, at least creates a kind of a secure area and reduces the likelihood of a kind of impulsive acts of violence. I mean, to return very quickly to what we were talking about before, I do think it's really important to make sure we know what the logic behind this is. Talking about constituency offices, well, we've also have experience with political gatherings like G7 meetings, G8 meetings, and so forth. And of course, there needs to be safety and security zones established, but we're also concerned that sometimes those zones are established so that the political leaders don't have to hear any messages from others. And so we want to be careful about the scope of these.
Yeah, Ga, what's your take on the necessity of these laws and anything you want to say in response to what Professor Moon said?
I think you're asking the right question, and the onus is on the government to justify that and to present really clear evidence why it's necessary. Because, as we were talking about the Oakes test, the justification test requires that it be necessary to the specific threats, that it's minimally impairing of the freedom of expression and protest rights. Um, and that it's proportional and it's really tailored and specific. So when we say, there's harassment or vaguely harassment or threats to MPs, obviously that's important because their safety is important too. But is having a bubble zone actually going to be responsive to that? They need to present the evidence to show that it does meet that test and it is necessary. Without the government providing that, it's very hard for us to opine on it, and that's the exact need why we need transparency on it.
Now, Ga, what do you see as happening with bubble zones in the future? Do you think we're going to continue to see them expanding? Do you think any courts might find any of these bubble zones unconstitutional. And I'll add that that Calgary bylaw that I mentioned earlier in the episode that prohibits specified protests, so protests about specific topics, that one is already subject to a constitutional challenge, with which the charity I work for, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, is bringing. But do you think that any of these are particularly vulnerable to court challenge? And do you think we might see more in the future?
I think it's inevitable that with the expanding use of bubble zones, that we'll see some challenges as we are already. And because it's really important that all of these rights gets tested and have that judicial scrutiny. I think particularly around the NP bubble zones, as we were talking about, I think that's particularly vulnerable.
Professor Moon, 30 seconds. Anything you want to add?
Um, Goodness, no. I do think we want to think very seriously about an idea that circulates out there around the right of listeners not to hear messages they don't want to hear. We want to be very careful about that because the reality is, if we're going to have any kind of political democracy, we have to be able to have conversation to hear things we don't want to hear.
Well said. Professor Moon, Grant, thank you both so much for coming on today to share your expertise. We've heard today about laws that restrict protests around certain places, so called bubble zones. And we've heard about the rapid expansion of this tool beginning in 2020. Are bubble zones a necessary limit on speech to protect the vulnerable? Or do you believe, as I do, that they're an unjustified limit that silences legitimate debate and undermines the democratic process? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.